The Battle of Athens, 1946. American soldiers just came home from fighting overseas for democracy, only to find out their own hometown wasn't a democracy at all. Their sheriff was a criminal. Their elections were rigged in broad daylight. And when they tried to fix it by voting, armed men attacked them at the polls. So they did something no one expects from American history class. They broke into a military armory, grabbed rifles, machine guns, and dynamite, and laid siege to their own county jail in a 6-hour gun battle. This isn't a movie. This actually happened in Tennessee in 1946, and almost nobody has ever heard of it. Welcome to American History Chronicles, the channel where we dig up the true stories America forgot to teach you. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe because this one is unbelievable. Let's go back to McMinn County, Tennessee. To understand how it got this bad, you have to go back 10 years earlier. In 1936, a powerful political boss from Memphis named Edward Boss Crump handpicked a man named Paul Cantrell to become sheriff of McMinn County. Cantrell won in what locals openly called the vote grab of 1936. And once he was in, he didn't just take the job. He rebuilt the entire system to make sure he could never lose it again. Here's how it worked. Sheriffs and deputies in the county were paid based on a fee system, meaning the more arrests, fines, and tickets they handed out, the more money they personally made. So deputies started arresting people for almost anything: public drunkenness, vagrancy, made-up charges against tourists just passing through. Over the following decade, this fee system alone funneled well over $300,000 into the pockets of Cantrell and his men, an enormous sum for a small rural county at the time. Corruption wasn't hiding in the shadows here. It was the entire business model of local government. And when election day came around, Cantrell's machine made sure it never lost. Deputies would seize the ballot boxes after polls closed and count them behind locked doors, with no outside observers allowed. Results would come back suspiciously lopsided every single time. For 10 straight years, nobody in McMinn County had a real vote. They had the appearance of one. Then World War II happened. Around 3,000 men from this one small county went off to fight overseas, something like 10% of the entire local population. They fought against fascism, against dictators who crushed democracy under their boot. And when they came home in 1945 and 1946, they found a smaller, homegrown version of exactly what they'd just spent years fighting against. It didn't take long for the friction to start. Returning veterans, used to their military pay and their freedom, started getting harassed and shaken down by Cantrell's deputies at local bars and dance halls, fined for the smallest, often invented offenses, just so the fee system could keep collecting. For men who had just risked their lives overseas, being robbed blind by their own sheriff back home was the last straw. So a group of veterans decided to fight back, not with weapons, not yet, but with ballots. They formed something called the GI Nonpartisan League and ran their own slate of candidates for local office, including a decorated combat veteran named Knox Henry, running directly against Cantrell for sheriff. Their campaign slogan was simple and pointed: your vote will be counted as cast. They weren't asking for favors. They were demanding the bare minimum of an actual democracy. But they weren't naive either. They knew Cantrell's men wouldn't just hand over power peacefully. So another veteran, a man named Bill White, organized a small armed militia of around 60 men to stand guard at the polls and make sure the vote couldn't be stolen again. They called themselves, only half-jokingly, the Fighting Bunch. Election day arrived on August 1st, 1946, and Cantrell's response left no doubt about what kind of fight this was going to be. Instead of the usual 15 or so deputies, roughly 200 armed men showed up at the polling stations that day, many of them brought in from outside the county specifically for this. Fights broke out almost immediately between deputies and GI poll watchers. Then, in the early afternoon, it turned violent in the worst way. An elderly black farmer named Tom Gillespie tried to cast his vote. A deputy blocked him, hurled a racial slur, and struck him with brass knuckles. Gillespie tried to run. The deputy shot him in the back. Gillespie survived, but the shot echoed through the town, and word spread instantly. This wasn't politics anymore. This was violence against ordinary citizens in broad daylight for the crime of trying to vote. As the polls closed, Cantrell's deputies didn't even pretend to follow the rules. They seized the ballot boxes, the actual physical evidence of who had really won, and retreated into the county jail, locking themselves inside with the boxes so no one could verify the count. To the veterans watching this happen, it was blatant and it was final. There would be no honest count, not unless they did something about it themselves. That night, a group of them broke into the local National Guard Armory. Inside were rifles, ammunition, and, remarkably, even a few Thompson submachine guns, left over from wartime stockpiles. They took what they needed and marched to the jail, where Sheriff Mansfield's men had barricaded themselves in with the stolen ballot boxes. What followed was almost impossible to believe happened on American soil. For roughly 6 hours, gunfire rang out between the veterans outside and the deputies barricaded inside the jail. At one point, the veterans set off dynamite charges outside the building. The blasts were powerful enough to flip a police cruiser and tear apart part of the jail's front porch. Deputies fired back from inside. Bullets tore through walls and windows across the block. And yet, almost miraculously, despite hours of sustained gunfire and explosions in the middle of an American town, not a single person was killed that night. Dozens were wounded, some severely, but no one died. By the early morning hours, Sheriff Mansfield's deputies had had enough. They surrendered, and control of the ballot boxes passed to the veterans. 6 of the 12 boxes had already been tampered with beyond recovery. But the remaining 6 told the real story, a clear, decisive win for every single GI candidate on the ballot, including Knox Henry for sheriff, by margins of roughly 2-1. The corrupt machine that had run McMinn County for a decade was finished in a single night. Paul Cantrell fled the county and never came back. Knox Henry was sworn in as the new sheriff. 400 residents gathered soon after to form a committee to keep the peace and make sure Cantrell's men couldn't attempt to come back. For a brief, remarkable moment, it looked like ordinary citizens, armed only with rifles, dynamite, and sheer refusal to accept a stolen election, had actually taken their county back. But here's the part most retellings leave out, and it's important because real history rarely wraps up in a clean bow. The new GI government didn't turn McMinn County into some perfect democratic showcase. Some of the very men who had fought to overthrow corruption ended up squabbling among themselves, and by 1948, less than 2 years later, the reform government had largely fallen apart, and county politics slid back into fairly ordinary, unremarkable machine politics. Even Bill White, one of the men who organized the armed resistance that night, later said plainly that he wouldn't recommend what they did to anyone else facing a similar problem. Their own message to other communities was blunt: don't try to settle election disputes with a gun. So what actually happened in Athens, Tennessee, wasn't a simple tale of good triumphing over evil forever. It was something messier and in some ways more honest. A group of citizens who had just fought a war for democracy overseas came home to find democracy stolen from them in their own backyard and used force, briefly and dramatically, to take it back. It didn't fix everything. It didn't guarantee the future. But for one night in August 1946, the people of McMinn County proved that a rigged election could be challenged by force if every legal option had truly been exhausted, something that has almost never happened again in American history, before or since. Today, the Battle of Athens is barely a footnote in most history books. There's a small historical marker in the town, and that's about it. But it remains one of the only times in American history, outside of the Revolution itself, that citizens picked up arms against their own local government and won the fight that same night. If this is the kind of forgotten American history you want more of, subscribe to American History Chronicles, and I'll see you in the next one.